How does a man go from the honor roll to a killing spree? How does someone once voted most likely to succeed come to believe that murder is an act of mercy, that each death is saving thousands of lives? In a locked drawer inside the county archives, there is a file thicker than any other from that year. The label is plain, just a date range in black ink, October 72, February 73. Inside are scene photographs, evidence logs, and coroner's reports. Spread across the table, they resemble the scattered pages of a novel. But this is not fiction. 13 deaths. Men, women, children, even a priest. Each crime in a different location. Cabins hidden in the redwoods, a quiet church confessional, a roadside garden. The weapons change. Rifle, pistol, knife, even a baseball bat. At first glance they share nothing. No obvious connection between the victims, no single method, no common motive. And yet, place the dates on a calendar and a shadow of order begins to appear. Witness statements describe a man who looked polite, even shy. Arrest records show no prior convictions, but the psychiatric notes, taken after his capture, tell a different story. An elaborate belief system in which the ground beneath California was on the brink of breaking apart. And the only way to stop it was through ritual sacrifice. Some of his victims, he claimed, had told him, without speaking, that they were ready to die, that they offered themselves for the cause. Detectives who interviewed him described the way he would explain this, calm and certain, as though discussing the weather. This was not a killing spree in the sense the public imagined. It was, in his mind, a mission, one that began without warning, escalated without pattern, and ended only when a single gunshot, witnessed by a neighbor, placed him in custody. Before we turn to the first scene in this chain of murders, subscribe to Gothic. Ledger, and tell us, where are you watching from, and what time of day is it? Fix that moment. Because in this story, dates and hours are not just markers on a timeline. They are part of the reason 13 people are dead. We begin not with the man himself, but with the first name in the file. A drizzly roadside, a car hood raised in silent invitation, and an older man known to locals as Whitey. The day he stopped to help would be the first day Herbert Mullin believed he was saving California from destruction. In the 1965 edition of the San Lorenzo Valley High School yearbook, the photograph of Herbert William Mullin occupies a modest corner of the page. His hair is neatly parted, his posture correct, his smile restrained. Beneath his name, in bold serif type, appears the distinction decided by his classmates: most likely to succeed. It was a quiet affirmation from those who knew him in the measured setting of a rural California school, an acknowledgement that this young man seemed destined for a respectable and accomplished life. Born April 18, 1947, Mullin was the second child of a household defined by order. His father, a former Marine, had carried the habits of military service into civilian life with the Postal Service. Discipline was constant and unambiguous. There were lines between right and wrong that were not merely taught, but enforced. His mother was equally committed to structure, though of a different kind. A devout Roman Catholic, she ensured the family's Sundays were spent in church, prayers were said daily, and confession was attended regularly. By most accounts from neighbors and teachers, Herbert was the product of these influences, respectful, neatly dressed, and attentive in his studies. School records show consistent grades above average, and his teachers noted a willingness to participate without seeking undue attention. On the athletic field, he displayed a determination that compensated for his slight build, earning a place on the football team. Former classmates recalled that he was not the fastest nor the strongest, but he was persistent, and that persistence was quietly admired. The home environment, as described later in interviews, was one in which expectations were clearly outlined. Chores were to be completed without reminder. Meals were taken together. The rhythm of the household followed a pattern that left little room for unpredictability. It was in this environment that Herbert learned to follow instructions, to meet obligations, and to present himself in a manner that reflected well on the family. Outside the home, he moved within a small but stable social circle. Classmates recalled him as polite, often reserved, yet capable of warmth when approached directly. He did not provoke, nor did he invite conflict. Photographs from the period show him among groups at school events, science fairs, athletic banquets, community gatherings, always well composed, always aligned with the expectations of the time. The yearbook accolade was not an exaggeration in the eyes of those who signed their names beside it. In 1965, with his high school diploma in hand, Herbert appeared positioned for the trajectory his parents had envisioned: further education, steady work, eventual family. There was no visible indication of instability or unrest. His manners, diligence, and willingness to serve in team roles suggested reliability. Yet in the archival record, this moment stands as a fixed image before the divergence. It is the point at which those who would later be interviewed could say with certainty, here he was still the young man they thought they knew. The photographs and notes from teachers offer no foreshadowing, no subtle sign in posture or expression. For those retracing his life in later years, investigators, reporters, psychiatrists, this early period is an anchor against which the later descent is measured. It is the control sample in a case that would challenge explanations of causality. How, they would ask, does the boy who stood on the football field with a quiet determination become the man whose name would be spoken in the context of fear? In 1965, that question could not yet exist. The yearbook page, the neat handwriting of classmates wishing him success, and the certainty of his parents in the soundness of his upbringing, these formed the last documented chapter of Herbert Mullin as the community's model youth. The records that follow would tell a markedly different story. April 18th recurs in the historical record like the hinge of an unquiet door. It is the date of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, the day the ground split and the city burned. It is the date, in 1955, of Albert Einstein's death, an ending that Herbert William Mullin would come to regard as a calculated act of protection. And it is the date of his own birth, in 1947, at precisely 6:06 a.m., an hour and minute whose symmetry would later hold significance only in his mind. By the winter of 1973, when detectives sat across from him in the interview room of the Santa Cruz County Jail, Mullin described April 18th as more than a personal milestone. In his account, it was a fixed point in a larger design, a day bound to the Earth's cycles of destruction and reprieve. He claimed that Einstein's death on that date had not been coincidence, but a deliberate sacrifice to prevent another great quake from swallowing California. Those born on April 18th, he argued, carried a responsibility to continue this work. Psychiatric evaluations from the period describe his thought patterns as systematized delusions, a framework into which he placed events, deaths, and natural disasters with precise, if unfounded, logic. He believed that when the population reached a critical density, the strain upon the planet demanded release. Earthquakes were the Earth's way of correcting imbalance. A sufficient number of human deaths, properly timed, could forestall the seismic correction. From police transcripts, his language was calm, unhurried. "It's math," he told one investigator, "death rate and birth rate. You keep them in balance, you keep the ground still." There was no suggestion in his tone that he viewed his acts as murders. Instead, he described them as contributions, necessary interventions to preserve life on a grander scale. Central to this belief was the idea of consent, not obtained in word, but conveyed through what he termed telepathic communication. He insisted that certain individuals, when their time came, would volunteer silently. In public spaces, on rural roads, even in church pews, he claimed to detect these unspoken agreements. A glance, a posture, an imagined phrase in his mind, these were the signs. Once he had received them, he considered the matter settled. The record shows that Mullin recounted his encounters as though they were exchanges of duty. "They told me it was okay," he said of one victim. "They knew what it was for." The absence of fear in these recollections is striking. He did not portray his victims as resisting, but as fulfilling an obligation they had recognized in themselves. Such reasoning did not emerge overnight. Reports from earlier psychiatric contacts note an increasing preoccupation with natural disasters in the years before his arrest. He followed earthquake bulletins, read historical accounts of major quakes, and began to make personal charts correlating death tolls with seismic events. To him, the numbers confirmed a pattern. When human deaths were numerous from other causes, earthquakes diminished. When they were not, the earth acted directly. Investigators and mental health professionals would later interpret this as an attempt to impose order on a disordered mind. In the absence of internal stability, Mullin constructed a system that explained both random tragedy and his place within it. The logic was self-sealing. If an earthquake did not occur, it proved his sacrifices had been effective. If one did occur, it meant not enough had been made. This framework gave his actions a consistency that, to outside observers, was both chilling and incomprehensible. Each choice of victim, each date selected, could be explained within the bounds of his belief. It was a closed loop, resistant to challenge, immune to external contradiction. Even in custody, confronted with evidence of his crimes, he returned to the same premise. The deaths were not killings, but necessary acts to keep California standing. In reviewing his statements decades later, the most enduring impression is not of rage or hatred, but of certainty. April 18th, the earthquake, the scientist and the voices, together they formed a calendar and a command. And in Herbert Mullin's mind, it was a command he could neither refuse nor delay. On the afternoon of October 13th, 1972, the stretch of road just outside the city limits of Santa Cruz was damp from an earlier drizzle. The traffic was sparse. The air carried the faint scent of eucalyptus from the groves nearby. A single vehicle, a 1958 Chevrolet Nomad, sat at the roadside with its hood raised. The scene was unremarkable to passing motorists. An older station wagon, a young man standing beside it, head inclined toward the open engine bay as if waiting for help. Lawrence Whitey White was known in the area. In his late 60s, he lived without a fixed address, moving between shelters and open spaces. Locals regarded him with the detached familiarity reserved for those whose presence was constant but unobtrusive. He carried no reputation for trouble. Those who spoke to him later described him as a man content with small exchanges, a cigarette offered, a nod of greeting, a brief word about the weather. According to police reports, White approached the vehicle without hesitation. The hood-up signal, in rural stretches, was still taken as a genuine call for assistance. Witness statements indicate that Mullin greeted him with quiet politeness and stepped aside to allow him a closer look. White leaned forward, peering into the engine compartment. It was at this moment investigators determined that Mullin moved to the rear of the car, retrieved a baseball bat, and struck. The blow landed to the back of the head. The county coroner would later record a single decisive fracture consistent with the strike of a solid object. There were no defensive wounds, no sign of struggle beyond the impact itself. The death was immediate. Mullin left the body at the roadside and drove away, abandoning the staged breakdown entirely. When deputies arrived later that afternoon, called by a passing driver who had seen the body, there was little in the way of physical evidence, and the bat was gone. the vehicle unidentified. Interviews with local residents yielded nothing useful. White's known acquaintances spoke of no arguments, no debts, no threats. In the absence of a motive, the investigation stalled. The killing was filed among the unsolved, a sudden, inexplicable act against a man with neither enemies nor notable possessions. It was only months later, during Mullin's post-arrest interviews, that the incident was connected to him. In his own words, the encounter had not been random, nor had it been motivated by anger or gain. He described seeing White on the roadside earlier that day and hearing, not through spoken words, but in his mind, a simple message: "I am Jonah, throw me over." He interpreted this as consent, a willing sacrifice offered in service of the larger purpose he believed himself tasked with. The detail about the car hood, Mullin explained, was to ensure proximity. He needed White to be in a position where the strike could be swift and certain. There was no indication in his account of hesitation or doubt. The act, he maintained, was necessary, and the victim had understood that necessity. Detectives noted the calm with which Mullin recounted this first killing. There was no embellishment, no attempt to minimize the act, only a flat description of sequence and outcome. In reviewing the file, the contrast between the ordinariness of the setting and the finality of the act stands out. A roadside, an open hood, a passerby offering assistance, the elements of a routine moment interrupted without warning and concluded within seconds. For investigators reconstructing the timeline of his crimes, the death of Lawrence White marked the point of origin. It was the first confirmed instance in which Mullin's private logic translated into lethal action. In the weeks that followed, the pattern would repeat, expanding in scope and frequency. But on that October day, the chain began with a single act, carried out in silence, on a quiet stretch of road where help had been mistaken for invitation. On the morning of October 24th, 1972, a light coastal fog hung over the roads leading inland from Santa Cruz. Along one such stretch, a young woman stood at the roadside, arm extended in the practiced gesture of the hitchhiker. She was identified later as Mary Guilfoyle, 24 years old, a student at Cabrillo College. Witness accounts from that morning describe her as carrying a small bag, dressed plainly, and facing toward the direction of traffic with the calm patience of someone accustomed to travel by this method. The vehicle that stopped was a 1958 Chevrolet Nomad, the same station wagon later tied to the earlier killing of Lawrence White. The driver, Herbert Mullin, offered her a ride. It was a brief exchange, unremarkable to anyone watching. She entered the passenger side, and the car continued east. According to Mullin's later statements, her destination was not far from the original route, yet within minutes it became apparent to her that they were not traveling toward it. The roads narrowed, the turns became less familiar. There is no indication she attempted to leave the vehicle, only that she began to speak to him, questioning the route. At some point, the conversation ceased. Mullin would later tell investigators that he killed her inside the vehicle. The weapon was a knife. The act was sudden, the wounds precise. There was no evidence of prolonged struggle, suggesting the attack was swift and deliberate. The coroner's report described multiple stab wounds to the torso, followed by incisions consistent with deliberate disembowelment. It is this stage, the dissection, that distinguishes the crime in the investigative record. Mullin removed the organs and placed them outside the body in what appeared to be an intentional arrangement. There was no attempt to conceal the remains in a hurried fashion. The placement, while not conforming to any recognizable ritual in criminology or anthropology, was deliberate enough to suggest a private meaning. When questioned, Mullin explained the act in terms consistent with his earthquake prevention delusion. He claimed that the organs had to be displayed in a certain way, though he did not or could not articulate the reasoning in terms others could follow. The positioning, he said, was how it was supposed to be, as if following a set of instructions only he could hear. The remains were later discovered off a rural road. There were no personal effects of value taken from the victim. Her identification came through missing persons reports, matched to physical description and dental records. Friends and fellow students at Cabrillo College confirmed she had been seen hitchhiking that morning, intending to travel to a planned appointment. Detectives reviewing the scene noted the absence of chaotic violence. The wounds were controlled, the removal of organs done with more precision than might be expected from someone without medical training. Whether this was the result of deliberate practice or an extension of Mullin's obsessive thinking remains unclear in the files. The case file contains photographs, now sealed from public view, documenting the arrangement of the remains. Investigators debated whether this indicated a signature, something to be repeated, or a one-time act aligned with whatever instructions Mullin believed he had received on that day. Subsequent killings did not replicate the display in this exact form, but the element of control over the scene remained a consistent feature. In his own account, given without visible emotion, Mullin described Guilfoyle as having volunteered telepathically. He insisted that she had accepted the necessity of what was to come. This, he said, allowed him to proceed without hesitation. The investigative record offers no evidence to support such a claim. It is preserved in transcripts only as an artifact of his mental state. In theirs, a chronology of his crimes, the murder of Mary Guilfoyle marked an escalation in method and purpose. It moved beyond the blunt immediacy of the first killing to something more calculated, more structured in its execution. For the investigators who would later connect the pattern, it was an early indication that Mullin's actions were not impulsive bursts of violence, but steps in a process he believed was both ordered and necessary. On the evening of All Souls' Day, November 1972, the nave of St. Mary's Church in Los Gatos held the stillness particular to early winter evenings. The light was dim but warm, filtered through tall windows onto rows of polished pews. Along the side aisle stood the confessional booths, their wooden lattice screens worn smooth by decades of penitent hands. Parishioners came and went quietly, pausing to kneel, to cross themselves, to enter the booth and speak their faults in low tones. It was here that Father Henri Tomé had served for many years. Known in the community not only for his pastoral work, but for a history that extended far beyond the parish, Tomé had once been a member of the French resistance during the Second World War. His wartime record was marked by the same persistence and quiet bravery that he now carried into his service as a priest in California. Parish records describe him as patient, measured in speech, and deeply respected by his congregation. On this night a man entered the church alone. He moved with no obvious urgency, pausing at the holy water font before making his way toward the confessional. Witnesses later recalled his appearance as unremarkable. A man in his mid-twenties, quietly dressed, his manner neither hurried nor hesitant. This was Herbert Mullin, raised within Catholicism and shaped by its doctrines in his youth. Mullin entered the booth. The precise content of the exchange that followed is known only from his later accounts, as Father Tomé did not leave the booth alive. Mullin stated that he spoke to the priest about matters connected to his previous acts, though he did not specify whether these included the murders already committed. What is certain, drawn from the physical evidence and the accounts of those present, is that the conversation ended abruptly. Mullin opened the door separating the two compartments. In the narrow space of the confessional, he drew a knife and drove it once into the priest's chest. The wound pierced the heart. The coroner's report described it as immediately fatal, though Father Tomé remained conscious for moments afterward. Accounts from those in the church that evening indicate that voices were raised briefly, one startled, the other calm. A parishioner entering the aisle heard Tomé speak words that were later remembered as a form of forgiveness. Whether the exact phrasing was "I forgive you" or something close to it, The meaning was unmistakable to those who heard it. For Mullin, the act did not require further justification. In his statements to investigators, he claimed that Tomei had volunteered for sacrifice, offering himself as part of the same telepathic consent Mullin believed he received from other victims. In Mullin's interpretation, the priest's final words confirmed this. "He knew what it was for," Mullin told one interviewer. The investigative record shows no evidence of any prior connection between the two men beyond Mullin's past attendance at Catholic services. This lack of personal history, combined with the location and the victim's standing in the community, made the killing deeply unsettling to residents and law enforcement alike. It was not a crime that could be attributed to personal grievance or material gain. Within hours, word of the killing spread through Los Gatos and beyond. Parishioners spoke of Father Tomei's years of service, his quiet dignity, and his life before the priesthood in the resistance against German occupation. The juxtaposition of that history with his death in the confessional lent the event a quality of tragic symmetry. Service at both the beginning and end of his adult life, each under mortal threat. For investigators assembling the timeline of Mullin's crimes, the murder at St. Mary's stood as a pivotal point. It confirmed that his actions were not limited by setting or by the social standing of his victims. The sanctity of the church had offered no deterrent. If anything, it appeared to Mullin as the fitting stage for a necessary act. When the booth was finally examined, there was little disturbance beyond the bloodstain on the wooden floor. The scene was contained, almost austere in its violence. For those who viewed it, the stillness in the aftermath was as striking as the act itself. A quiet that carried the weight of both confession and absolution, fixed in the final exchange between a priest and the man who had come to kill him. The first visible cracks appeared in the late 1960s, subtle enough at the outset to be explained away as stress or youth, yet persistent enough that those closest to him began keeping quiet notes in memory. A changed tone, a new rigidity in routine, a look that lingered too long on nothing at all. In interviews conducted years later, family and classmates placed the shift somewhere between graduation and the end of his engagement, ordinary time on a calendar that would, in hindsight, mark the border between a promising life and an interior weather no one else could feel. Accounts from his fiancée described a narrowing of acceptable behaviors. Choices as small as where to sit or what to order became points of control. When she disagreed, he corrected, at first verbally, then with quick, chastening gestures meant to end discussion rather than harm. Friends noticed he preferred plans that required no negotiation. The young man, once praised for reliability, began to treat everyday variance as a threat to be managed. His sister's recollection, recorded for investigators, provides one of the clearest early symptoms. During a family meal, Herbert mirrored her husband with unnerving precision. If the fork lifted, his fork lifted. If a glass was set down, his glass followed to the same place on the table. If a chair scraped back, his chair scraped in answer. He seemed, she said, to be inside a posture not his own, moving as if compelled. Later, psychiatrists would identify the behavior as echopraxia, a phenomenon sometimes observed in schizophrenia in which a person involuntarily imitates the actions of another. What felt that evening like an odd private game would be reclassified as evidence of a deeper disorder. Around the same period, his outer affiliations changed. He loosened his connection to Catholic practice and took up a studied interest in Eastern religions. He read as a conscientious objector. None of this, on its face, suggested illness. Many men of his generation traced similar paths. But in his case, the interests hardened into systems. He read with the intensity of someone collecting instructions rather than ideas, cross-referencing meanings until only one interpretation, his, remained. The introduction of drugs complicates the record without clarifying it. By his own admission, he experimented with marijuana and LSD. He would later insist that each was harmful to his mind and that others had urged him into their use. His parents, observing the same timeline from the outside, suspected the substances were the source of everything that followed. Clinical reviewers did not agree. While acknowledging that hallucinogens can precipitate crises in vulnerable individuals, they noted that the pattern of Herbert's symptoms, paranoia, imitation phenomena, the slow organization of fixed, elaborate beliefs, suggested a process unfolding whether or not drugs were present. In their view, intoxication may have accelerated what was already emerging or simply coincided with it. What he reported internally, when he reported anything at all, was less concrete. He began to speak of being watched, not in the usual way a young man might mean it, but as if attention itself were a force. Neighbors, he felt, were arranging their movements to influence his. Acquaintances were withholding information required for his well-being. He considered innocuous coincidences to be messages. He grew attuned to numbers, to dates, to repetitions in speech. He did not describe fear so much as a pressure to interpret, as if he would fail some essential test if he didn't decode what the world had placed in front of him. Those who saw him only occasionally still found him courteous. He kept himself neat, arrived on time, fulfilled basic obligations. Those who saw him often noticed the narrowness. Meals were eaten in silence or not at all. Errands were plotted with attention disproportionate to their importance. He began to prefer solitude not for rest, but for alignment, time to reconcile the day against the pattern he believed it obeyed. Medical contacts during this interval were limited, informal, and ultimately inconclusive. No single intervention fixed a date to the onset. The evidence survives instead as a constellation, a family dinner and the mechanical copying of another man's movements, a fiancé learning to avoid choices, a stack of borrowed books annotated as if they contained orders, small experiments with drugs followed by larger assertions about their harm, a young man increasingly certain that meaning preceded everything. By the early 1970s, the scaffolding of his thinking was in place. From the outside he remained recognizable, the same careful gait, the same polite phrases, the same face that once anchored a yearbook caption about success. From the inside the world had flattened into signal and response. What others called coincidence, he called instrus, action. What others called suggestion, he called command. And once the commands were sorted and ranked, there were not many ways the story could proceed. It began with a conversation that, in another context, might have been forgotten by nightfall. On a February morning in 1973, Herbert Mullin arrived at the home of Kathy Francis, a 30-year-old mother living with her 2 sons in a small cabin near the tourist site known as the Mystery Spot. The Francis home sat just off a dirt road, surrounded by redwoods, in an area where the forest could still swallow sound. In the course of their exchange, Francis provided Mullin with the address of a mutual acquaintance, Jim Gianera. In Mullin's mind, Gianera was not just an old friend from years before. He was the man responsible for introducing him to marijuana, a fact Mullin had come to view not as casual but as catastrophic. Within the framework of his delusion, this act had set in motion the deterioration of his life and, by extension, the necessity of what he now considered corrective violence. From Francis's cabin, Mullin drove directly to the Gianera residence. The timeline reconstructed from witness reports and crime scene analysis indicates that he entered sometime late in the morning. Gianera was shot at close range with a handgun. His wife, Joan, was stabbed multiple times, the wounds suggesting a rapid and forceful attack. Neighbors later recalled hearing nothing unusual until police arrived hours later. The Gianera home showed no signs of forced entry or prolonged struggle. Detectives noted that the killings, while brutal, appeared to have been carried out with speed and without the chaotic disarray common to crimes of opportunity. Mullin's purpose had been singular and, in his mind, completed. Yet the morning's conversation at the Francis cabin now presented a complication. Someone knew where he had been going. Some time after leaving the Gianera home, Mullin returned to the Francis property. By then the day had turned damp and cold. The Francis cabin, decorate, Eid for Christmas though the season had passed, stood quiet in the overcast light. Inside, signs of struggle were evident from the moment the door was breached. Kathy Francis's body was found near the centre of the room. She had fought back, detectives later determined, but the outcome had been swift. Her 2 sons, both young, were discovered in their bunk area. They had been shot and then stabbed. In one case, Mullin had pulled the boy by the foot to bring him within reach. A small table in the living space was overturned, and the Christmas tree, its ornaments cracked and scattered, lay on its side, strands of tinsel catching what little daylight filtered through the windows. The killings at the Francis home carried none of the detached volunteer rationale Mullin had described in earlier murders. To investigators, this was the clearest example of an action taken for practical, not delusional reasons, the elimination of a potential link in the chain of events. That the victims included 2 children added a level of community outrage that endured long after the trial. The proximity to the mystery spot, a roadside attraction known for its distorted perceptions of gravity and balance, became an incidental yet unsettling footnote in the case. For locals, the name's association with a crime scene of such violence lent it an entirely different connotation. In the police file, the events of that day form a compact sequence: morning conversation, targeted killings, return to silence a witness, departure before law enforcement was aware that anything had occurred. By nightfall, 4 people were dead, their lives linked only by geography, acquaintance, and the decisions of one man. When asked later about the sequence, Mullin did not dwell on the details. He returned instead to the grievance against Gianera, framing it as both a personal betrayal and a disruption to the larger order he believed himself tasked with protecting. The deaths of Francis and her children were acknowledged only as necessary within that day's work, an extension of the plan once it was set in motion. For the investigators compiling the full record, the Gianera and Francis murders demonstrated how quickly Mullin's scope could expand. What began as the resolution of a private score became, within hours, a series of killings that left 2 households emptied, and a community confronted with the fact that in this case there were no boundaries. Neither age nor setting nor prior friendship offered any protection once Mullin had fixed his intent. The redwoods of Henry Cowell State Park hold a quiet that can absorb almost anything. In the outer trails where tourists walk, that quiet is punctuated by voices and the crunch of gravel. Deeper in, beyond the mapped footpaths, the forest narrows into a canopy so dense that sound travels unevenly, and a single shot can vanish into the distance as if it never occurred. It was into this interior, in February 1973, that 4 teenage boys carried their camping gear. They had chosen a site not authorized for public use, a flat clearing near a slope of mossed boulders, far enough from marked trails to avoid detection. The choice was typical of youth, more private, more daring, and without the constraints of campground rules. Their tent was pitched near a small fire ring, with sleeping bags unrolled inside and supplies stacked neatly nearby. At some point during their stay, they encountered Herbert Mullin. In his later account, the meeting was unremarkable until the moment he claimed to have received telepathic consent from the boys. As with earlier victims, Mullin insisted that the decision had been mutual in a way no one else could detect, that they had silently agreed to die in order to prevent the earthquake he believed was imminent. The sequence that followed was reconstructed from forensic evidence rather than witness statements. Mullin entered the tent with a rifle and fired at close range. The shots were placed to the head, each fatal on impact. The lack of defensive wounds suggested that the attack was sudden and complete, before any of the boys could respond. The forest absorbed the sound. No one in the nearby residential edges of the park reported hearing gunfire. The tent remained upright, its flap closed, giving no outward indication of what lay inside. Days passed before the scene was discovered. By then, the February weather had slowed the process of decay, preserving the arrangement almost as it had been at the moment of the killings. When the crime scene team arrived, they found no signs of struggle outside the tent. The boys' belongings were undisturbed, backpacks still zipped, food supplies intact, personal items in place. The impression was one of sudden interruption, as if the campers had been frozen mid-rest. Investigators catalogued the positions of the bodies and the angle of the shots, noting that the shooter had likely stood just inside the tent entrance, firing in quick succession. The cause of death was immediate in all 4 cases. Autopsy reports confirmed that the bullets were of a specific caliber. That detail would later prove crucial. In February 1973, only days after the killings, Mullin was arrested for the murder of Fred Perez. The rifle in his possession was subjected to ballistic testing, and the bullets recovered from the redwoods matched its markings precisely. This connection allowed detectives to place Mullin in the forest at the time of the murders, closing a gap in the timeline of his spree. In custody, Mullin spoke of the boys without visible remorse, returning to the idea that their presence in a prohibited section of the park was itself a violation, something that, in his view, justified their inclusion in the sacrifices he was making. For the families, the location added to the isolation of the loss. The clearing was difficult to reach even for law enforcement, requiring a hike through unmarked terrain. There was no roadway, no open field, only a narrow break in the trees where a small tent had stood, invisible to anyone not already searching for it. In the official record, the Redwoods murders occupy a stark place. They were not precipitated by personal grievance, nor were they the result of confrontation. The victims were strangers, selected in the moment and dispatched in the same. The forest concealed them until long after the shooter had gone, leaving only the stillness that had been there before, an indifference as complete as the act it had masked. On the morning of February 13th, 1973, the neighborhood off Lighthouse Avenue in Santa Cruz carried the ordinary rhythm of a Sunday. Lawns were being watered, newspapers retrieved from porches, and hedges trimmed before the afternoon tide of visitors arrived from the city. Among those at work was 73-year-old Fred Perez, a retiree known to neighbors for his careful gardening. He kept a small plot at the front of his modest home, arranging rows of flowers alongside vegetables in a pattern that reflected both patience and habit. At approximately 10 a.m., a 1958 Chevrolet Nomad turned onto the street. It slowed as it approached Perez's property. Witnesses later recalled that the driver, a man in his mid-20s, did not appear hurried. He brought the vehicle to a stop near the curb, rolled down the driver's window, and raised a rifle. The shot was a single discharge. It struck Perez in the chest, and he collapsed instantly among the plants he had been tending. The rifle was lowered. The window slid shut, and the Nomad pulled away at an even pace. There was no exchange of words, no sign of provocation. From a neighboring property, a resident who had been washing his car saw the act from start to finish. In the seconds after the vehicle departed, he memorized the license plate and telephoned the police. His description of the car, its color, and the driver was detailed enough to be broadcast within minutes over patrol channels. Responding officers circulated through the city, focusing on arterial roads that could carry the suspect toward the surrounding hills or the highway. It was a clear day, traffic moderate. Just under 2 hours later, a patrol unit spotted the Nomad heading east. The vehicle was stopped without incident. The driver identified himself as Herbert William Mullin. In the back seat lay the rifle, a .22 caliber, later confirmed through ballistic. Two have fired the shot that killed Perez. Mullin offered no resistance during the arrest. According to officers on the scene, he complied with instructions, stepping from the vehicle and submitting to handcuffs without remark. His demeanor was described as calm and detached, with no outward sign of agitation. In the patrol car, he made no spontaneous statements. Perez's death was, on its face, inexplicable. The two men had no personal connection, and investigators found no evidence of prior contact. For those compiling the record of Mullin's activities, the killing fit a pattern of apparent randomness that had characterized much of his recent violence, strangers selected and dispatched without confrontation. Yet in Mullin's later account, Perez, like others, had agreed to die, his consent transmitted telepathically in the seconds before the trigger was pulled. The location of the killing, a quiet residential street on a clear morning, contrasted sharply with the remoteness of some earlier scenes. There were no forests or winding dirt roads to obscure the event, no days-long delays before discovery. In this case, the act was witnessed in real time, the vehicle identified, and the suspect in custody before the day's mail had been delivered. For the investigators who had been tracking a growing list of unsolved homicides in Santa Cruz County, the arrest was a turning point. In the hours after Mullin's detention, the connections between him and a series of killings, some months old, others only days, began to take shape. The rifle in his possession matched not only the Perez shooting, but also ballistic evidence from the murders of 4 teenage campers in Henry Cowell State Park. His presence in the county during the dates of other unsolved cases placed him squarely in the investigative frame. In the final chronology of his 4-month spree, Perez's murder marked both the end and the beginning, the end of Mullin's freedom, and the beginning of the formal process of accounting for 13 deaths. In the physical record, it remains a simple scene. A man at work in his garden, a car slowing to a stop, a single shot. The elements are mundane, the outcome irrevocable. In the spring of 1973, a Santa Cruz County courtroom became the stage for a question without a simple answer: how to measure a man's responsibility when his mind operates within a private order of its own making. The proceedings against Herbert William Mullin would not turn on whether he had killed, by then the evidence of his actions was beyond dispute, but on whether he could be held fully accountable under the law. From the first day the trial drew public attention. The press gallery filled early, and rows of wooden benches were taken by residents of Santa Cruz and the surrounding towns, some connected to the victims, others compelled by the scale and strangeness of the case. At the defense table sat Mullin, in plain clothing, flanked by his court-appointed attorneys. His posture was attentive, but not visibly tense, his expression often unreadable. The legal issue at the center was one of sanity in the narrow statutory sense. California's standard at the time followed the Manhattan Rule, requiring proof that the defendant either did not understand the nature of his act or did not know it was wrong. For the defense, this meant persuading the jury that Mullin's diagnosed paranoid schizophrenia rendered him incapable of moral or legal comprehension during the killings. Psychiatrists for the defense described a man with a fractured grasp of reality, fixed delusions about preventing earthquakes, elaborate systems of telepathic communication, and a belief in volunteer victims. They cited symptoms, echopraxia, thought disturbances, compulsive associations that aligned with chronic mental illness. In their view, these features combined to override his ability to judge his actions by ordinary standards. The prosecution did not dispute the diagnosis. Instead, they argued that mental illness alone did not meet the threshold for legal insanity. They emphasized Mullin's plan: luring victims, concealing his presence, returning to silence witnesses. These, they contended, were acts of someone aware of consequences and actively avoiding detection. Mullin himself took the stand, an uncommon choice in a case of this nature. He spoke in a steady voice, explaining that his family, neighbors, and others in his life had conspired to force him into killing. He described his victims as having agreed without words to be sacrificed for the greater good. To him, this was not murder, but service. He maintained that his actions had spared countless others from destruction in a coming earthquake. For the jury, the task was to reconcile these two portrayals: a man whose thinking was undeniably disordered, and a man who nevertheless executed a series of killings with deliberation. They listened as trial testimony traced the events from the roadside death of Lawrence White to the final shot that killed Fred Perez. Each act laid out in photographs, forensic reports, and eyewitness accounts. After 3 days of deliberation, the verdict was delivered. Herbert William Mullin was found legally sane at the time of the crimes. He was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 8 counts of second-degree murder. The sentence was life in prison. The ruling closed the trial, but left open the broader question of how far the law should bend in the presence of profound mental illness. In prison interviews conducted in the years that followed, Mullin continued to argue that he bore only partial responsibility. He sought what he termed vindication, suggesting that a court should recognize the role of others, family, acquaintances, even strangers, in shaping his path to violence. His language remained consistent with the beliefs he had held at the time of his arrest. For those who had investigated the case, there was no ambiguity about his future. They viewed the killings as the product of both disordered thinking and purposeful choice, a combination that made release an unacceptable risk. He was, is, and will always be a paranoid. "Schizophrenic," one investigator remarked, "and heaven forbid he ever walks free." The official record closes with the sentence imposed, but the trial's weight endures in the intersection it exposed, where madness meets calculation, and where the law, faced with both, must still decide on guilt. The official record ends with Herbert William Mullin serving a life sentence, 10 murder convictions, 3 more deaths linked to him in the file. The courts declared him legally sane. The psychiatric evaluations declared him profoundly ill. Between those 2 findings lies the space this case still occupies, where calculation and delusion move together, and where neither alone can explain the 13 bodies left behind. In interviews decades later, Mullin's beliefs remain intact. He still speaks of earthquakes averted, of victims who offered themselves, of a duty fulfilled. For the investigators who followed him from crime scene to courtroom, there is no question: he must never walk free. But the question for history is different. How does a mind fracture so quietly that no one sees the danger until it has already claimed its toll? These pages will stay closed now, filed again among the others in the county archives. The photographs will remain sealed, the dates fixed, the names unchanging. But the quiet roads and forest clearings where these deaths occurred still exist, unchanged to the eye, altered forever in the record. If you've watched until now, subscribe to Gothic Ledger and tell us in the comments where you are listening from and at what hour. The places and the times matter. They always have.